Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, April 25th, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. After announcing that he would not seek re-election as the NDP Member of Parliament for Timmins-James Bay, Charlie Angus has stepped into a new role as a vocal leader in what he calls Canada's resistance against U.S. President Donald Trump, fascism, and rising threats to democracy. This week on Rabble Radio, Charlie Angus joins Rabble editor Nick Seebruch to discuss the resistance, the growing threat of Maple MAGA, and how everyday Canadians are pushing back against creeping U.S. influence and far-right politics in their own communities. Here are Nick Seebruch and Charlie Angus in conversation. Take a listen.
I'm here with NDP MP for Timmins-James Bay, Charlie Angus.
Former NDP MP.
That's correct, former NDP MP. Yeah. Once the writ drops, that all goes away. And as you mentioned last year, you announced that you weren't running for re-election. But in a recent CBC interview, you said you're not going to be on the sidelines. You're going to be going all out. And that's why we wanted to have you here today to talk a little bit about that.
Perfect. Let's get down to it.
All right. So tell me a little bit about what you've been doing. You have a Substack called Charlie Angus / The Resistance, and you've been going to a few communities across the country to talk about some of the things you've been discussing on that Substack. So let's start there.
Well, the morning after the Trump election, I knew that everything had been upended. And I also felt that we really needed a frame, an analysis, a way of speaking about this to understand the historical significance of this moment. So I started speaking up. I spoke in Parliament. I started the Charlie Angus Substack, and it just exploded because I think people understand that this is a moment unlike anything else that we've seen in our lifetimes. And a lot of people are worried that, the sort of the political class doesn't see the seriousness, or just they don't want to confront the fact that we are now dealing with the rise of fascism on an unguarded border. And what does that mean for Canada? What does that mean for the world? And so I've sort of been thrust into this role of being a voice and of people reaching out to me. And so we've started touring, speaking in communities from Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, Edmonton, across Northern Ontario. We were down in London, Toronto, and I'm getting requests to travel everywhere because people see this as a moment, but they see this also as the need to create a movement of resistance to defend democracy and the rule of law in Canada.
Now, you mentioned members of the political class not necessarily wanting to face the reality that we're in with Donald Trump. Whenever Trump started his career, he was, sort of buffoonish, kind of a clown. Not a lot of people took him seriously. But as the years have gone on, things have become more serious. Obviously, he's leveled significant tariffs on countries around the world, including Canada. He also has made many statements about wanting to annex this country as a so-called 51st state. So how are you convincing people that what he's saying, he is serious? Because it does seem so unthinkable that our neighbor that we've been friends with for so many decades, centuries, is all of a sudden now a threat to our sovereignty.
What has been really amazing, and I don't really have anything to compare it to, is that the resistance in this country really began with ordinary people suddenly saying, wait a minute, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to let that happen. I think the political leaders attempted initially to downplay Trump. Prime Minister Trudeau went to Mar-a-Lago. Daniel Smith went to Mar-a-Lago, but I think for different intentions. I think Prime Minister Trudeau thought he could, be the Trump whisperer and everything would be okay. And instead it made Canada seem weak. And then the threats got worse. I'm very much of the belief that if Canada hadn't taken a super strong position, that the intimidation and the threats of annexation would increase. But we've seen across the country incredible resistance. The boycott is without precedent. People are really determined to defend their country. And I think they're going to hold their political leaders to account if their political leaders don't stand up and defend our country as well.
And you have been talking on this tour with a lot of Canadians across the country. What are you hearing most often about what they're wanting to see from their political leaders and what they're wanting to do as acts of resistance against the U.S.?
It's not just that our country has been threatened, but we're watching the rule of law disintegrate south of the border. The kidnapping of people, arbitrary detentions, attacks on universities, the whole-scale gutting of the American government institutions from health to even their spy agencies. We realize what happens if we let the conspiracy rage machine get their hands on power. It certainly affected Pierre Poilievre. I mean, it's an unprecedented drop of like 20 some points in the space of 2 months. Good on him, because he's driven this rage anger machine very much like Trump, and Canadians have said, no, we're not going to put up with that. What's really important for us now is to seize this moment of coming together in a way that I haven't seen people come together before across the country, across regions, across even political lines, that we make the most of this and we say that we need to actually make Canada pretty much a shining beacon for resistance. And I'm not bragging when I say that the rest of the world is watching Canada. We have become the front line of defense to Trump, not the Democrats, not the US courts. It's Canada and it's ordinary Canadians. And that's something really incredible to witness.
And we're on the front line against, obviously, if not one of, if maybe the only world superpower. It's a behemoth of a nation in terms of the economy, its military. So how can Canada, that's so proportionally smaller, resist the US on the world stage?
There's been a number of things that have become really obvious. One is that we become very united, and a united country can take on a divided country. The United States is tearing itself apart. I speak every day to people in the United States who are just sickened, panicked, frightened by what's happening. We're seeing resistance starting now in the United States. It's not coming from their political leadership. Again, it's coming from the grassroots. But Canada, we're seeing this unprecedented level of unity. I'm getting messages from people in Quebec who say, I've been a sovereigntist my whole life because Canada didn't seem to offer me anything. Now I see what's at stake. I'm proudly Canadian. I talk to people from rural Alberta. I talk to retired veterans. I talk to people in the urban areas. And it's really important. I think the left gave up a lot of ground that we shouldn't have given up. We gave up, our flag. We let the convoy nutters took our flag and disgraced it. A lot of what people, they're trying to find a national story of resistance right now. And a lot of people are looking back to the story of Canada in the Second World War. It's something we haven't talked about, something we didn't, we moved on. We didn't think that was a story worth telling. But, in the fight against fascism, Canada was there from day one, and Canada paid an intense and incredible price fighting fascism. And right now that story is coming back, not in a jingoistic way, not in this sort of chest pumping and right wing way, but in a way that says, we were the front line in the fight against fascism. Our uncles, our grandfathers, many of them paid the ultimate price, freeing other people to live in liberty. And we can't let that sacrifice drop now. So there's an opportunity for us to reclaim language that we've given up and to take space back that I think really belongs to the progressive people of this country, and to say the vision for Canada has to be progressive, because what we're facing is absolutely regressive.
Now, in terms of taking back that language and taking back that space in the political realm, you mentioned, setting out a vision. What are some other ways that politicians can reclaim those things that you say that the right wing have taken, like the flag and the patriotism and all that?
Well, I think it's the encouraging of resistance. It's something I've seen in every event I've been at, where we're literally turning people away at the door because it's, there's so many people coming out. They want to be reassured that we are standing together. What we saw happen in our country is I think we let a lot of things slip, and we were sleepwalking towards a disaster like the United States. I think after COVID, people were cranky, people were unsure of their neighbors, people weren't speaking to each other. I think a lot of people in the progressive community got comfortable being on Zoom. Well, you're not going to change the world on Zoom. It's impossible. Zoom can play a role, but you have to get out there. You have to go to church basements again. You have to go to community halls. You have to meet strangers that you don't necessarily agree with. That's how we organized before. That's how movements are built. And now we find, because of the threat of Donald Trump, we're stumbling our way back towards basic lessons in community organizing. That's really, to me, is an exciting moment. I'm seeing people who've never been in a demo before. A woman who contacted me, she didn't know what to do. And so she thought she'd do a protest at a Tesla. She didn't know who would show up. She didn't know if she'd get yelled at. And then her neighbors came out, and it was so invigorating that they're taking other Tesla protests on. I spoke to a woman in Toronto who was so sick to her stomach of the doom scrolling, she didn't know what to do. So she started knocking on neighbors' doors, people she didn't know, asking if they thought they could do something, and they ended up organizing their street. That's how we used to do community organizing back in the day, and that's what we've got to reclaim. And it's a moment for us to be there in the trenches with people from all across the spectrum of our great nation.
Now, we have a lot of grassroots groups in this country who have a lot of experience in community organizing. Who are some of the allies that you're seeing in this fight? Unions, for example.
Right now, I think it's starting to form up. I will say, and I'll keep repeating it, it's been ordinary people that didn't have any political background, people didn't have organizing experience, who just started these local elbows up chapters, started local groups. That's really exciting. I'm going to be in Kingston very soon, and we're going to see about building models where we can move from the rally to how do we then start to build grassroots. I was at an Elbows Up chapter, the founding meeting in Toronto at Metropolitan United Church. And this was a huge rally, but it was seen as the first step of going back to old style community organizing. So right now, I think a lot of the labor unions have been full on in the fight because it's their jobs on the line. So there's been that component, but I think we need to start merging and bringing together all the different groups that are fighting towards fighting Trump, fighting the threats that are being faced at universities, the threats against students. And we know that right now, Pierre Poilievre is repeating a lot of the same language. He's threatening to deport students here. He's threatening to cut off funding to universities. He's threatening to use the notwithstanding clause to override legal rights. This is the MAGA playbook. So number one, right now, we got to stop that MAGA machine from taking power in Parliament while we continue the grassroots.
So that was something I did want to ask you about, is about Pierre Poilievre. He's been painted as a Canadian Donald Trump. Maple syrup MAGA is a term I believe I've heard used. So you feel that this is a fair comparison, that he is, it's not just a political attack to undermine his credibility, but it is a fair comparison that he is bringing Canada further into that right-wing, populist, fascist brand of politics?
I don't fear Donald Trump. I know a united Canada can defeat Donald Trump and his gangster cronies. I do fear MAGA Maple in a big way, because if they get power in Canada, we are going to see a nation's democracy run based on rage algorithms. That's how Pierre Poilievre has run as a member of Parliament. That's how he's run the Conservative Party. I've sat across from the Conservatives. If you're not spouting conspiracy and rage, you're sitting on the back bench. I will say I have worked with many Conservatives over the years, many Conservatives I have respect for. I had lunch with Aaron O'Toole, who was unceremoniously thrown, off the back of the truck by the Conservatives. Me and Aaron probably don't agree on very much, but I respect him as a parliamentarian. I respected him as a Canadian. I disagreed with all of his politics, but he would be willing to serve the country. Poilievre is a very different political animal, very much in the Jordan Peterson rage convoy MAGA machine, and we've got to stop that. That's job one right now. And once we stop that, then it's going to be making sure that the larger vision of a progressive Canada will actually come out of this crucible that we've been put into.
Now, going back into that mirror comparison between America's right-wing party and Canada's right-wing party, we saw in the States how Trumpism, MAGA, it infected the Republican Party, and it became a poison that they just could never shake away. And could that happen here? And are our institutions as vulnerable to being undermined as you mentioned earlier, that we're seeing in the States, institutions being undermined, right to due process being undermined? Are Canada's institutions vulnerable in that same way?
I think there's always been a real naivety in Canada that we're somehow just nicer than Americans. We see ourselves as this nation of likable slackers who just, we never went for the gold ring, but we looked out for each other. But you're seeing real warning signs. Ian Brody, former Chief of Staff to Stephen Harper talking about how Poilievre would probably move with lightning speed against the federal civil service. He talked about the Doge North scenario, and that it would actually be easier in Canada for Poilievre to initiate this kind of Doge attack on, the independent civil service than it even was for Trump. We see Poilievre talking about using the notwithstanding clause to override the courts and override legal decisions. That's a very, very dangerous precedent. And I think we've left ourselves open to this because there's always been this sort of sense, and I got this when I was first elected, this kind of gentleman's code of Parliament that, we may disagree with each other, but we'll always respect the institutions, even though we don't necessarily always have the checks and balances to force that respect for democracy. So if you have someone who's not respecting it, we could be in trouble. This is why I'm at this point, I think stopping Pierre Poilievre is going to be, it's job one right now, and then we can go back to dealing with Trump.
Right, and that leads us into our current federal election, which we have less than a week until voting day. Now, is Donald Trump, for you, the most important issue in this election?
We need to be on a wartime footing. This is what I've been saying since the day that Trump was elected. That Canada needs to see where we're at in 2025. Where we're at in 2025 is a world of difference than where we were in 2024. And I think we need to start talking honestly to Canadians about the things that we're going to need to do as a nation to defend our democracy, to defend our border, to make us stronger in an age of gangsters. So yes, the threat of Donald Trump right now, we have to have a plan.
And for voters who maybe are concerned about other issues, like that they feel maybe climate change is being pushed to the side, how can they rest assured that issues like that will not be forgotten in the oxygen that Trump takes up in this election?
Well, I think we need to be really smart in this election. I think number one is stopping conservatives. But I know I was just on Vancouver Island. Tenille Johnson is a phenomenal candidate. She's going up against a residential school denier. We can't let that happen. In Edmonton, Heather McPherson, Tricia Esterbrook, Blake Desjardins, I was down with Lindsay Matheson in London, Brian Massey in Windsor. We need to have New Democrats who are there to make sure that these key issues are not thrown under the bus. You mentioned climate change. What is really concerning is how, from the get-go, as soon as the threat of Trump happened, the oil lobby and Daniel Smith were throwing the issue that we had to build more pipelines, otherwise it'd break our country up, that somehow burning the planet with a Canadian flag wrapped around it is patriotism. It's not. So we're going to need to have a parliament where we have enough elected New Democrats. So I know many people are desperate to stop Pierre Poilievre. I know I give top marks to Mark Carney's campaign. It's been a smart campaign. He's actually reached the moment of this issue of being a wartime prime minister. But there's going to be areas where New Democrats are the choice. New Democrats are the way of stopping Poilievre. So I trust in the intelligence of our voters, particularly progressive voters. Let's make sure we vote in enough numbers so that we get back with a balance in Parliament, so that all these other issues are maintained while we are dealing with the threat of tyranny south of the border.
Now, you mentioned that obviously defeating Pierre Poilievre is so important, not just for the issue of Trump, but climate change and many other issues. We saw in the States that Donald Trump lost an election. The Republican Party lost several elections, and MAGA didn't go away. Do you think that defeating Pierre Poilievre would be the end of his style of politics in Canada, or is it something we have to be ever vigilant for?
We certainly see on the right, like the disappearance of what used to be a progressive conservative party has been, has changed politics. We saw the Republicans, it used to be moderate independent Republicans. It's all gone MAGA. I think what we're also witnessing, though, is a civil war in the Conservative Party between Doug Ford's kind of grifter populism versus the MAGA machine out of Alberta. I think there's going to be a lot of blood on the floor if Poilievre goes down, and the Conservatives are going to be fighting amongst themselves. Will that mean they split into two factions again? The idea of moving back towards the center is going to be difficult because a number of their key people don't believe in any kind of political center, even a center right. But that's their decision. For right now, our job is saying, no, Poilievre, you're not fit for government office. Too bad, so sad. Let the chips fall where they may.
All right, and I just have a couple more questions for you, Charlie. One is for yourself. What's next for you? What's next on the Resistance Tour, and what are you planning on down the road?
Well, it's been the great honor of my life to serve in Parliament for 21 years. My riding was bigger than the United Kingdom. They decided that somehow my people were overrepresented, so they threw on an extra 20,000 square kilometers, about a dozen new communities, hundreds of miles of road that I was just didn't think I was going to do that after 21 years. So I had to make a choice. Right now, the resistance is going full out. We're going to be speaking, I believe, in Regina, Guelph, Kingston are the next stopovers. One just near a couple stops in Toronto. So I'm really engaged in that and seeing how we can start to build the movement of grassroots resistance. That's really exciting for me. I got a lot of projects. My band Grievous Angels, we're going into the studio. We're playing the Horseshoe Taverns, our next show in Toronto on June 1st. So I'm playing with the band. I'm doing a lot of writing and volunteering in Northern Ontario at our little mining museum. I do the underground mining tours in the summer. So I am full out busy, busier than I've ever been.
Very cool and good to hear. And my last question is, for those of our listeners who want to get involved with the resistance, what is the best way for them to do that?
Contact us at info@charlieangus.ca. We're a very, very small team right now. There's just a couple of us trying to juggle all the balls in the air, and we're getting lots of requests, lots of ideas. But contact us at info@charlieangus.ca, and we're trying to figure out how we can start to build this into a broader movement of progressive resistance for our country.
Wonderful. Charlie Angus, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
That was Charlie Angus and Rabble editor Nick Seebruch in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Nick and Charlie. And now this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. For that, I'll turn things back over to Rabble editor Nick Seebruch. Back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. This week in Canadian politics. With just days left before Election Day, all of Canada's major federal parties have released their party platforms. Rabble decided to take a look at where each party stands on 2S LGBTQIA+ rights. The Conservative Party, of course, has been the most openly hostile to the queer community, especially trans individuals. The Conservative Party platform does not include any statement of protections for the rights of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, but it does include transphobic language about barring trans women from using women's bathrooms. The Liberal Party, in its platform, is committing to support national pride organizations, addressing hate crimes, and implementing new and more affordable in vitro fertilization programs. The NDP platform simply states that it will address rising hate across the country, including hate targeting the 2S LGBTQI+ community. The Greens have the most comprehensive platform, and they are committing to making more funding available to the 2S LGBTQIA+ community and nonprofits, implementing gender-neutral bathrooms in federal buildings, as well as more equitable federal hiring practices for queer workers. In other election news, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind held a candidates forum in Toronto earlier this month to ask candidates from each party questions related to disability issues. Candidates from the Liberals, NDP, and Green Party were in attendance. Among the issues discussed was the need to increase the National Canadian Disability Benefit Program, which all candidates agreed that $200 a month was not enough. Liberal candidate Leanne Cotler said her government would commit to hiring a Chief Accessibility Officer, while Green Party candidate Mike Morris said that his party wanted to review the National Building Code to ensure that it was a requirement for buildings to be accessible. Also, Rabble columnist Shea Kalra is arguing that the next party to form government should review the National Bereavement Policy. Current federal bereavement laws allow for 3 days of leave after the death of a loved one if the person taking the leave has been with their current employer for a minimum of 3 months. Kalra explains that this is not always sufficient for someone to recover from the death of someone close to them. Grief is a journey and a process that can take up to 2 years on average for a person to get through. CALRA is advocating that Canada's bereavement policy should provide paid leave for a period of 1 month, which can be taken flexibly over the course of 2 years. In other Canadian politics news, Independent Canadian Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard is calling for reform in the nation's prison system, specifically to change rules around solitary confinement. Despite court decisions in 2019 finding the practice of solitary confinement to be a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the practice does continue in federal prisons. Senator Bernard was the deputy chair of the Human Rights Committee, and in 2021, her committee issued over 70 recommendations on ending solitary confinement in federal prisons. Despite her committee's report being 4 years old at this point, none of the recommendations had been implemented. With the previous session of Parliament ending when the current election was called, Senator Bernard fears that her committee's report will be shelved. Senator Bernard recently went on a tour of federal prisons, both as a fact-finding mission and to also raise awareness about her committee's work to end solitary confinement. And finally, Rabble columnist Lois Ross is arguing that there needs to be stronger legislation protecting the right to repair and ending planned obsolescence. In order to grow their profit margins, some companies employ tactics designed to force users to buy their products over and over again. Whether it be cell phones, farm equipment, computers, or other tools and devices, some companies design their products to fail after a certain period of time to force their customers to buy new ones. These same companies also do their best to make it difficult for customers to repair these products themselves once they fail, often forcing them to return to the manufacturer, who will charge an exorbitant price to fix the product. Ross explains how in farming, when a tool fails and can't be easily repaired, this could lead to delays in planting and harvesting crops. As always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Nierenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.